The debate around Superman will not end, with some claiming it's doing great, others maintaining it's headed straight for flop territory. The only thing there is universal agreement about is that the international audience let Superman down, and that could lead to trouble down the line. Why would they do that, and how is the movie really doing? Let's find out. This video is sponsored by Fume. By the time all was said and done, Superman opened to $125 million, coming in higher than the official box office tracking figures. Now, this is where some might interject that, nuh-uh, they said it was going to do $175 million at one point, so let's address that right away before we move on to what the opening weekend figure actually means and why the international audience didn't show up. Remember at the eve of last year's election, there was an outlier Iowa poll which had Kamala Harris up by 13 points, and everyone freaked out about that? And then it turned out, Trump won Iowa handily anyway, leaving broken reputations and lawsuits in his wake. Well, that poll was way more credible than that $175 million opening weekend prediction. The ultimate source of that claim wasn't the studio or any other tracking entity with something of a track record themselves, but rather Jeff Snyder of former Collider fame, and lest we forget, of having the crap beat out of him by Uwe Boll fame. Either way, he was the one who relayed this figure during an appearance on the Hot Mic podcast, having learned it from one of his sources, and he had also learned that, quote, Superman stinks. Now, I'm not going to accuse Snyder of anything here, and we're about to move on from this, but as we have covered in several videos now, there's a clear anti-David Zaslav sentiment in Hollywood. So I wouldn't rule out that Snyder may have been fed disinformation designed to undermine Superman. So all Snyder did was follow his habit of relaying information, this time without questioning it too much. See, that's the thing with habits. Some are harmless, others not so much, and Fume makes them easier to swap out. Have you ever caught yourself reaching for a bad habit without even thinking about it? Well, that's where Fume, the sponsor of today's video, offers a simple and enjoyable way to break away from bad habits while still having something satisfying to reach for, by way of flavored air. If you haven't heard about flavored air before, then think of it as herbal tea, as opposed to the sticky soda that is vaping, and Fume is an award-winning flavored air device. It looks awesome and is made to be fidgeted with soothing snaps and clicks, thus filling the void of any bad habit you may want to ditch. Fume has lots of delicious flavors to choose from, like crisp mint. There's no vapor, so you can use it anywhere, and obviously there's no addictive nicotine. On the contrary, Fume continuously invests in third-party studies to ensure the safety of their products, meaning Fume is backed by doctors in the US. With flavored air, you can satisfy your fixation through a passive diffusion system that utilizes no electronics, vapor, or combustion. Fume has served over 500,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. For a limited time, if you order the Journey Pack using my code MidnightSedge, you'll get a free Fume Topper, an awesome accessory to level up your experience. Click the link tryfume.com MidnightSedge, that's tryfum.com, or scan the QR code on screen to get yours today. Thanks to Fume for sponsoring this video, and with that, let's return to the actual box office for Superman. Let's begin with the good news, which would be the domestic side of the equation, where Superman opened to $125 million, which is the third biggest opening weekend of the year, and more crucially, the biggest opening weekend for a comic book movie since last year's global smash hit, Deadpool and Wolverine. A movie which in every way was a fluke, and it even performed like a pre-lockdown Avengers movie. In an ideal world, Superman's box office should have been closer to that of Deadpool and Wolverine, But that didn't happen, and never mind what some headlines are trying to tell you. When you adjust for inflation and ticket price hikes, Superman's opening weekend attendance, that is, number of butts in seats, as opposed to the amount of devalued dollars the audience had to fork over, is actually down by almost a third since Man of Steel. Who cares that it opened bigger than the flops Brave New World and Thunderbolts, given such a decline since the previous Superman reboot and solo movie? How is a $125 million opening weekend in any way good news? Because we live in a shittier world now. That's how. When Man of Steel opened back in 2013, the entertainment world was at its financial peak because the audience was consistently entertained. With the two most recent Nolan Batman movies having crossed the billion-dollar threshold, as well as the then two most recent Marvel movies. But now, in 2025, how many years have it been since we had two good comic book movies in a row? That, in addition to streaming and a general economic downturn, is going to affect how many venture out to see any comic book movie in theaters in this day and age. Given what some call comic book movie fatigue, which is a politically correct way of saying that the audience is walking away after being force-fed a diet of lackluster and propagandistic DEI-driven comic book movies for years now. I mean, even James Gunn addressed this, though he was of course less direct in labeling what the output of the last few years have been than I was.
I don't believe in superhero fatigue. I think there's, mediocre movie fatigue. And if the only thing that we have to offer is one character showing up and seeing two characters together that we've never seen on screen before, that was really exciting when it first happened. Nobody cares anymore. This concept of superhero fatigue in one way is real because there have been a lot of superhero movies that maybe haven't been up to what they should have been or what the audience wanted.
All in all, I think Superman opening to $125 million is as high as it ever had the potential to open in this day and age. Because remember, Superman is not Batman. Superman may be more iconic, but Batman is more popular, which indeed is why Warner demanded Zack Snyder scrap his plans for Man of Steel Part 2, when the studio felt the first one underperformed, and instead bring in Batman to save the day for the sequel. Lest we forget, James Gunn's Superman is after all a new beginning for the DC brand. A brand which the audience lost both faith and interest in years ago, meaning this Superman reboot always had an uphill struggle, and they know that. From Warner's perspective, it would be nice if Superman made money on its own, but it's more important that it gets the audience excited for the future. That's the true measure of its success. Case in point, Batman Begins. In isolation, that movie was a financial disappointment. But it set the stage for $2 billion sequels. What Warner really needs here is for Superman to do that, and it would appear they think it will. With the opening weekend in the can, David Zaslav doubled down on James Gunn and his vision, saying in a statement, "This weekend, we watched Superman soar as James Gunn's passion and vision came to life on the big screen." Superman is just the first step. Over the next year alone, DC Studios will introduce the films Supergirl and Clayface in theaters and the series Lanterns on HBO Max, all part of a bold 10-year plan. The DC vision is clear, the momentum is real, and I couldn't be more excited for what's ahead. I hope for Zaslav's sake that Superman is going to have an excellent hold in the all-important second weekend at the box office, as the second weekend drop is the true indicator for word of mouth, and that obviously isn't in yet. I'm reminded of the Friday the 13th remake from back in 2009. When it had a huge opening weekend, the producer spoke high and mighty of sequels to come, but then it dropped like a stone in its second weekend, and that franchise has been on hiatus ever since. Hopefully, things won't turn out that bad for DC, but if anything, the one thing they should be as, or even more concerned with than the second weekend drop-off is the comparative lack of interest internationally. Comicbookmovie.com writes, Superman's lower than expected international box office haul could be a big problem in the long run, saying, with slightly out-of-date numbers mind you, Superman opened to an estimated 122 million in North America this weekend, adding 95 million from overseas for a 217 million global bow. It's a strong start for the DC Studios reboot, but one that's raised concerns about just how high the Man of Steel will fly in the weeks ahead. Jurassic World Rebirth took an expected bite out of the movie, while the Fantastic Four First Steps is also approaching. And Superman fell short of initial expectations with its 95 million international haul, meaning only 44% of its global cum came from those markets. That's a big deal, because for years, and certainly during the height of the MCU, 60% or more of the global total would come from international markets, so that's a big shortfall. The write-up continues. That's left North America and Canada to do the heavy lifting, especially after it only grossed 13.3 million combined from China, Japan and South Korea. The movie also made less than expected in Europe, with a combined 9.6 million from France, Italy and Spain. In the UK, it opened with 9.8 million, a decent start, albeit one likely negatively impacted by a recent heatwave in the country. That's a cope. UK cinemas have air condition. Then, siping the wrap, the piece continues, as the trade explains, along with general superhero fatigue internationally. Superman has never been the global box office draw that Batman is thanks to Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. While there have been some arguments that the decline of the US's image under Donald Trump is impacting a hero that for decades was associated with truth, justice and the American way. Even with Gunn downplaying that last part in his film, box office history suggests it's not that simple. They then cite that only 51% of the gross for Superman Returns came from international audiences, but that because of the Nolan effect, that increased to 56% for Man of Steel, implication being, international audiences just aren't that into Superman on his own, which is true. What these articles don't answer though is why. Why did the international audience first develop the habit of seeing Superman in larger and larger numbers, only to break that habit, as if it had been a bad habit, and they just discovered flavored air from fume? That is something which should greatly concern David Zaslav and James Gunn. I don't have anyone to quote here, but as an international audience member myself, I do have some insights. You see, superheroes are very specifically an American phenomenon. The closest equivalents to them around the world are in pagan folklore, but it's only in America where superpowered beings doing good make up the majority of the contemporary national comic book scene. That doesn't happen anywhere else. Sure, the American superhero comics have readership all over the world, albeit a small one. What I mean here is that outside of the US, there are no local superheroes of any note being produced in any of the local comic book scenes around the world. Because superheroes are very specifically an American thing that you won't really find anywhere else. And this also extends to the traditional popularity of comic book movies, or more specifically, superhero comic book movies. Both Richard Donner's original Superman and Tim Burton's Batman are both remembered with great reverence and respect in the US. Internationally, however, they are, for the most part, both regarded as well-made, but cheesy and often involuntarily funny schlock. If you were to ask any random European film critic to list the most consequential, say 50 films of all time, then I assure you, Donner's Superman won't be on that list. Because it really isn't all that revered outside of the US. Even the original X-Men made significantly more domestically than internationally when it came out now quarter of a century ago. Because the X-Men were, outside of the geek sphere, virtually unknown outside of the US. It was only when exceedingly well-made Hollywood productions, first by filmmakers like Sam Raimi and then by Chris Nolan, and then by consistent quality from the MCU, gradually made international audiences flock to these movies, and eventually in greater numbers than in the US. That's the key point here. It wasn't the legacy of the comic book characters themselves that drew in the international audience, as international audiences are only vaguely aware of that legacy. No, it was that Hollywood consistently gave the audience a good time. That's when the international audience started showing up in big numbers for superhero movies. A good example here actually is the past Superman movies that Comic Book Movie via The Wrap brought up. When Superman Returns came out in 2006, audiences around the world had just had such a good time with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1 and 2 that 51% of the gross for Superman Returns came from international audiences. But I submit that were it not for those Spider-Man movies, if Superman Returns had come out in a vacuum, it would have been lucky if the international audience made up as much as 40% of its worldwide gross. By the time of Man of Steel, propelled by the quality of the Nolan films and the early MCU films, the international portion of the worldwide gross had jumped to 56%. But now, another decade later, with the exception of last year's Deadpool and Wolverine, comic book movies have consistently been propaganda and failed to deliver a good time. Then all audiences drop out, of course, but international audiences drop out more and faster. Because without quality of storytelling, superhero movies are back to schlock that doesn't really resonate outside of the US. I think that's what's going on here. That's why this Superman is underperforming internationally. It's the cumulative effect of all the goodwill that made audiences around the world flock to these very specifically American movies being squandered over the past decade. We're back to the days of the original X-Men, where the split between domestic and international gross is concerned now. So for the international audience to return, they must again be shown that these movies will entertain. And DC is at a particular disadvantage, because it's the Marvel brand that the international audience came to trust, and that there is nostalgia to play on, meaning Gunn is going to have to win over the international audience from scratch. No pressure. Good news though is that it has been done before. Can it be done again? Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments, and before you go, remember that for a limited time, if you order the Journey Pack using my code MidnightSedge, you'll get a free fume topper. An awesome accessory to level up your experience. Click the link tryfum.com/midnightsedge, that's tryfum.com, or scan the QR code on screen to get yours today.